The following podcast is a deep, shallow dive production.
And you're going to love it.
Okay, let's go.
Hey, happy Friday, everybody. Hope everybody had a good week. All right, so here we go. Today I'm going to basically play for you the audio of the documentary that was created by ViceTV in, looks like it was May of 2020. So wow, that's pretty crazy. They got that out pretty quick. So May of 2020, it's called Bernie's Blackout. I've talked about it before, and I think it's going to be really interesting. I did manage to cut it down, and I will try to only interject where I think is kind of appropriate and needed. But I think you're going to really enjoy this. I think it's going to be incredibly enlightening. And more than anything, I think it's going to help you understand, if you don't already, really the power that the mainstream media has and had in the 2020 Democrats election, which ended up having Joe Biden, obviously then go on to become president. And so you'll see really what took place against Bernie Sanders. And then, it's kind of up to you from there to extrapolate that out and, see if you maybe look at the situations, plural, that have taken place with Trump from 2016 to 2020 to 2024, and see if you think about that stuff any different. If you do, great. If you don't, great. The goal of this is just to really kind of expose you to something that I thought was incredibly well done. So anyway, all right, let's go into this. Let's dig into this.
Television is an extraordinary technology that can educate people, bring this world together, and yet it's been prostituted by commercials, by people who own it, who only want to use it for money.
The 2020 Bernie Sanders campaign will be remembered for its passionate supporters.
We are here at Frank and Pierce University in the snow, happily for Bernie. All for Bern.
It's progressive politics.
People are standing up for justice. That is what this campaign is about.
The surprise victories.
NBC News projects Bernie Sanders, the winner in Nevada. Brand new breaking news numbers.
And the absolute disgust of the mainstream media.
All right, I bet a few of you were like, oh, I wonder how many seconds it's going to take for Ray D to interrupt it. But I did want to interrupt it real quick and say, okay, so remember that, Bernie Sanders really had a unbelievably passionate base of supporters, and they were referred to as the Bernie's Bros. They also called them Burners. They called them Bernie's Burners. But man, they were unbelievably supportive, and again, almost more supportive than what's referred to as MAGA on the Trump side. So anyway, did want to mention that so you remember just how unbelievable that base of following he had. And what's funny? It's not really there anymore. I mean, those guys it's not really vocal. Maybe they're still there. But anyway, all right, let's get into the mainstream media. And really what started to happen once Bernie was winning.
No other candidate has anything like this sort of digital brown shirt brigade.
Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl.
Can you explain why you're still in the race?
He saw nowhere near that level of support.
Don't get your hopes up on Bernie yet.
Bernie, you're full of it.
Don't come here and dream of your violent overthrow of America.
The abuse that we have all been subjected to by Bernie Bros.
Bernie Bros, right?
The corporate media is there to further the agenda of the establishment.
Ran by billionaires and hosted by millionaires.
There is real concern right now that Bernie Sanders is so far ahead in the lead.
Democrats need to sober up and figure out what the hell they're going to do about that.
What happens when corporate media unites against one candidate?
I don't really trust any of them because what they want is ratings.
They're serving a customer base, and the advertisers from which they get their money are also serving a customer base.
That was pretty interesting. She said they're serving a customer base, and then the advertisers with whom they get their revenue from are serving a customer base. So remember, I did that 5 whys of why is politics so divisive? And the answer basically came because of the money and because of the advertising base. That's interesting that kind of got reaffirmed there.
Yes, Wall Street is powerful.
First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you.
Are you all ready for a political revolution?
Let's rock the boat. In fact, let's tip the boat over.
That is the establishment's nightmare.
2/3 of all voters said they were uncomfortable with a socialist candidate for president. What do you say to those voters, sir?
What was the result of that poll? Who was winning?
All right, so the result of that poll was Bernie Sanders was winning. So again, remember, Bernie Sanders was winning, and this is where we are.
It's February 2020, 9 months from Election Day. But the race has already been in motion for more than a year. The Democratic field has narrowed from 21 to 11 candidates, and Bernie is in a tie with 4 other nominees. And that's no small feat. Since he recovered from a heart attack in the fall, the mainstream media has been attempting to write Sanders' political obituary.
So this is a major development in the race. How will it affect who becomes the Democratic nominee?
He had a heart attack.
Yeah, well,
he had a heart attack in the fall. Do you think the American people deserve to know more?
But some would argue that mainstream media has been unfairly dismissing Bernie Sanders since his last presidential campaign in 2016.
So by the way, there was a lot of controversy about Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign when he was running for president and he ended up losing to Hillary Clinton that year. You know, there was also a lot of chatter that was manipulated as well, because again, in 2016, they didn't think he could beat Trump. And so they said that they basically pushed him aside and brought Hillary into the mix. And then in 2020, you're going to see the same thing was sort of getting set up where he was leading, but whomever probably thought he couldn't beat Trump.
Some are sounding the alarm. The headline of Jonathan Chait's piece in New York Magazine reads, "Running Bernie Sanders against Trump would be an act of insanity." Over at The Atlantic, Bernie can't win.
After the heart attack, there was a lot of talk that Bernie Sanders was done, it's over, the campaign's finished.
David Sirota is senior advisor and head speechwriter for Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign. He has a pivotal role in creating the campaign strategy for fighting the media blackout.
Progressive campaigns need to be run as professionally and as ruthlessly as the campaigns that are run by the other side.
Well, the Bernie blackout was a term that came up that described how the media weren't really covering the campaign. I think the term also became a catch-all term for the media's specific kind of coverage, but I also want to be very clear. That doesn't mean I think that there wasn't good reporting, good journalism on the campaign trail. What we're really talking about here is, in many cases, cable news and the pundit shows.
Okay, so that is an important distinction. You know, when they're talking about a media blackout, Bernie's blackout, mainstream media, you know, you really are talking about cable news and the pundit shows. So, you know, again, CNN, MSNBC, I mean, Fox would fall into that category. And then obviously you have ABC, CBS, NBC, those guys, which, you know, aren't necessarily cable. But again, that's sort of the definition of the mainstream media. It's really the stuff. Unfortunately, most of Americans continue to this day to get their news from versus, you know, independent sources, smaller networks, podcasts, things like that. And so here are examples of, you know, how the cable networks and mainstream networks talked about him.
And he looked like the angry man in the center of the stage saying, "Get off my lawn."
I think he comes off as mean. I think he's disparaging.
Cable news, there was certainly examples of just open hostility.
Bernie, you're full of it. You're going to be a miserable president.
It could be a framing, it could be a sentence, it could be a way of describing a situation that, again, always tended to look at Bernie Sanders as not really a serious candidate for president.
You know, when you watch the documentary on TV, you see all the familiar faces, you know, Joe Scarborough, Chris Matthews, you know, Tucker Carlson was in there. So you see all the actual, you know, people that you recognize. And then, you know, I will say this, and this is just the reality of it. Unfortunately, you know, it's a vain, superficial comment, but you know, Bernie Sanders with his messy hair and his, you know, looks like a disheveled Einstein. I will say he never did really look the part of being a president. I mean, he more looks like, that mad scientist versus the president. Although, I mean, I guess you could say who does look like a president. Although, now that I say that, as much as you might not like Biden or you might not like Trump, I mean, they definitely have, they have much more of a presidential look than maybe Bernie Sanders does.
Whether the mainstream media gets it or not, we have millions of people who have invested into this campaign. We have professions like teachers and nurses who really believe in the senator, workers who work at places like Amazon, everyday people of this nation. They do truly understand who is on their side and who will change the material conditions of their lives.
I'll tell you something funny. If you didn't know she was talking about Bernie Sanders, I guarantee you 10 out of 10 people would have thought that little blurb was talking about Trump.
What the American people in this country need, they need somebody that is unabashed and that has the courage and the conviction to stand up for them and to call out the rigging of this system. And that candidate is Senator Bernie Sanders.
Isn't that funny? I mean, seriously, for those of you that hate Trump, please put your Trump derangement syndrome to the side for a second. But that statement, I mean, that absolutely is a statement I could see, someone that is advocating for Trump to say that practically verbatim. All right, so again, remember, we're in February of 2020, and we're in Iowa, which is the first Democratic caucus. It all starts in Iowa. So this was like the beginning, quite frankly, of the end.
People are really excited, and there are so many people coming into Iowa from all parts of the country to really support Senator Sanders. The weather may be chilly, but the hearts of the people here in Iowa are very warm, and they are feeling the burn.
The Iowa caucus, the first official contest in the election season. Historically, victories in Iowa lead to momentum that becomes essential to win other states. And just days before voters head to the polls, Bernie Sanders is in the lead, predicted to capture the coveted Iowa momentum.
We've brought 130 volunteers with us this weekend. This is my second weekend coming to Iowa to come knock on doors for Bernie.
We just got a whole fleet here. I've heard there's over 1,700 out-of-state volunteers in Iowa now at this point, the weekend before the caucus.
The campaign works its way through Iowa, making small stops along the way to a large rally in Cedar Rapids.
This platform, it became something super important for me that I feel like I just have to be a part of it.
The more I listen to these interviews, the more I realize, man, this Bernie Bros fan base or support base was unbelievably passionate, and there was a real emotional connection between them and Bernie. Honestly, even more than Trump. I would really say that base of people that were the burners were absolutely more, I guess, emotionally invested in Bernie Sanders than, quite frankly, any other presidential candidate I've seen in a long time. I mean, it feels real.
All across America, independent journalists and media creators have been reporting outside of the mainstream media.
It's not clear how much they are even aware of their bias.
We have to be building a movement that is bigger than just Bernie Sanders himself.
Without network airtime, they use their own resources to call out the hypocrisy in America's corporate press.
When I was at MSNBC, I saw what many people saw early on, before the primary had even started on the Democratic side, that Hillary Clinton would be a bad candidate.
So though I admire and respect Secretary Clinton deeply, I must say, don't run, Hillary. Don't run.
All right, so I think this is jumping back to 2016 in terms of Hillary Clinton. So this is really interesting. Give this a listen to what she says happened at MSNBC when basically they were advocating against Hillary.
But afterwards, the Clinton people called and complained to the MSNBC top brass and threatened not to provide any access during the upcoming campaign.
I was called in by my boss who said, that was fine, but anything else that you do on Hillary Clinton needs to be submitted to the president of the network.
Now, being a human interested in maintaining my job, I'm certain I did less critical Clinton commentary after that than I maybe otherwise would have.
Mainstream media has a boss. Their boss is not a working class person. The mainstream media isn't owned by the people. It's owned by rich people. And rich people tell them what to say.
The corporate media is there to further the agenda of the establishment, of the oligarchs, because they own it.
I recognize that voice. That's Jimmy Dore, the comedian. I think I've played him a few times. But, you know, really, man, this is interesting. This is all reinforcing, again, like I said, that simulated 5 whys that I put in ChatGPT that asked why politics is so divisive. And again, it comes down to the advertising dollars that are being paid into it.
Democracy has been stolen from us. It's been hijacked by the very, very wealthy, and it's being held ransom.
In 1982, 90% of media was controlled by 50 companies. Today, the media landscape has changed. AT&T, Comcast, Walt Disney, and Viacom together account for $386 billion in total revenue. Now, only 4 corporations own about 90% of the media landscape.
The daily agenda at any network is driven by its leader.
Ultimately, they're serving a customer base, and the advertisers from which they get their money are also serving a customer base.
So that's pretty wild at the consolidation when it comes to the space. You're really down to 4 gigantic corporations that own everything. And so when a corporation owns so many different touch points, they have the ability to create a unified message of all those touch points or to all those touch points. And then, I mean, that's really how you create a narrative. You create a narrative by having, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of touch points say the same exact thing. Here's an example.
Greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities, the El Paso, Las Cruces communities.
In 2018, a viral video was released showing Sinclair Broadcast Group directing its anchors to all fall in line with the same message.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
It was a shocking example to many people that networks have an agenda, and that agenda comes from the top leadership.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
You'd be more informed just by sitting on the couch and drinking a bottle of gin.
A lot of journalists depend for their career on access to the establishment. And a lot of the pundits, which are routinely on cable news and routinely called upon for quotes in mainstream publication articles, depend on that establishment for their own livelihoods.
The demographics of who watches network television, who watches cable television like MSNBC and CNN, it's mostly older people.
Independent media has done so much to help Bernie Sanders fight back, and they've also had this partnership with young people in America.
The revolution will not be televised. Most people know that phrase. So what does that mean? So we can't expect to go to MSNBC, CNN, or any of these major news networks to actually get a breakdown of like what needs to be done to change this world into one that's better for most people.
I think what makes this so interesting to me is, you know, this is coming from the perspective of really liberals. This is all liberals. This is all Democrats. There's probably not a conservative Republican shown in this movie, maybe outside of like a small clip from Tucker Carlson. You know, the rest are all Democrats and they're all liberals. So to me, the most interesting thing was, if this can happen within the Democratic Party, how on earth would it not happen against the Republican Party? If they can do this Democrats against Democrats, of course they're going to do it Democrats against Republicans.
Everyone thought Iowa would declare a winner by 10 p.m. But as the hours tick by, reporters and voters realize something's wrong. There's a serious issue involving the reporting of the votes.
All right, pay attention to this part. I mean, this is really interesting, and I'm sure we all forgot about this because, again, I'm not even going to say it, but just think about it as it relates to 2020, and then think about it potentially as it could relate to 2024.
Ready? This is our first official explanation from the Iowa Democratic Party. Ready? The integrity of the results is paramount. We have experienced a delay in the results due to quality checks.
say if he wins New Hampshire, which he will, this isn't going to happen in New Hampshire because they have an actual primary.
What can you tell us about what happened in terms of reporting results from your precinct?
Well, I think as you just mentioned, the app that we were told to download just hasn't been working.
They're making big bets on Iowa. Who's going to get talked about and in what way between now and New Hampshire? You know, this is very much domino effect.
We had a really good showing, double what I saw in 2016 when I campaigned for Bernie Sanders.
They just don't want to say Bernie won.
We don't know exactly what's going to happen tonight. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few minutes.
By midnight, only 2% of the votes have officially been reported, but Mayor Pete nonetheless decides to make a play for the coveted Iowa momentum.
This is the stuff that I find so ridiculous. So basically, he said only 2% of the vote had been collected, but Mayor Pete, that's Pete Buttigieg, the worst Secretary of Transportation in the history of the world, decides to make a play. I think this is like not appropriate to be able to say things when 2% of the vote has been tabulated.
So we don't know all the results, but we know by the time it's all said and done, Iowa, you have shocked the nation.
Pete Buttigieg declares victory in Iowa, but 3 days later, the actual numbers are in, and Bernie makes his own victory speech.
Just in case you missed that, he said 3 days later, the actual numbers are in. I'm going to make my prediction right now. I think this is going to be the case for this election this year. I don't think a winner is going to get called, declared, whatever, on November 5th. I think it's going to be days later.
Despite getting more votes, the media claims that Pete has won the momentum.
Buttigieg has the razor-thin lead over Sanders in the state delegate equivalents, which actually counts. This afternoon, though, Bernie Sanders declared victory in Iowa based on the raw votes.
Mayor Pete's been declaring a win for days now. Why should people believe your victory speech over his?
Because I got 6,000 more votes. And from where I come, when you get 6,000 more votes, that's generally regarded to be the winner. Yes.
Iowa was a mess, and that unfortunately meant that we didn't get the boost out of winning the most votes in Iowa that would have helped build more momentum.
The data, there was no revolution in terms of turnout. The numbers went down.
The numbers went up with young people and with people of color. That's a great indicator going into states that are a lot more diverse. Sure, more regular white working class people did not vote, but more people of color went and voted for Bernie Sanders. I know that's kind of hard to hear for a lot of people out there who don't like Bernie Sanders, but that's just the facts.
After the messy, unclear results from Iowa, attention's turned to the next major competition, New Hampshire.
So just to be clear, because it was a little confusing. So Bernie Sanders won the Iowa caucus popular vote, but Pete Buttigieg was declared the winner because of winning based on the state's delegate votes. I mean, that stuff is definitely confusing. I'll dig into that delegate stuff and the Electoral College, and I'll do an episode on that. But anyway, so that set the stage for the next state. And the most important thing to take away from that is Joe Biden is nowhere to be found. Actually, they didn't even mention his name at any point throughout this yet. So think about that. You haven't even heard Joe Biden's name, nor have you heard Kamala Harris's name.
Despite Bernie's lead, the media finds a way to frame it negatively. Chuck Todd and others framed the narrative that Bernie is polling well below his numbers in 2016, when he beat Clinton by 20%. It's a debatable perspective, because this primary has many more candidates than in 2016. Expectations for such a decisive victory for any of them is absurd.
Despite having any results in Iowa, the candidates are turning their sights to the Granite State for a crucial final push for votes.
The Iowa caucus system had some inherent flaws. Sanders' campaign didn't get the narrative it deserved of coming into New Hampshire.
We are here at Franklin Pierce University in the snow, happily for Bernie. All for Bern.
They seriously loved this guy. They really did, man. People had a true emotional connection with Bernie Sanders.
I think his campaign is a phenomenon that's not really getting the credit for what he's accomplished.
All right, so what happens next is they start to attack his policy.
What we saw was that Bernie's policy agenda was used to make an argument that Bernie can't be elected president. He's too, radical, et cetera, et cetera.
No other candidate has anything like this sort of digital brown shirt brigade. I mean, except for Donald Trump.
All right, that was interesting.
I mean, except for Donald Trump.
The entire idea of electability is an intangible, almost undefinable idea that the media itself gets to define. And that's a problem.
All right, this is starting to talk about the concept of electability. Is Bernie Sanders electable? And especially in this case, could he beat Trump?
But the electability conversation is a relatively new addition to Bernie's 2020 campaign. In 2016, the media mostly tried to ignore him.
January 1st, 2015, I think through November 2015, ABC Evening News had us on for 20 seconds.
What was it you did that was so newsworthy? They showed more of the open podium waiting for Donald Trump than ever playing your speeches.
This is a huge crowd.
I think the Bernie blackout is an ideological tendency to ignore his campaign altogether, but especially to ignore any sort of good news around his campaign.
There was a Reuters article, apparently, where the headline was, Buttigieg comes in second, Warren comes in, Klobuchar comes in third, and Warren comes in fourth. Just didn't mention who won.
That's pretty wild. It doesn't even mention that Bernie Sanders won. It talks about second, third, and fourth. And again, remember, we've got Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Elizabeth Warren. Those are people that were in the conversation. They still have literally not brought up Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. That's pretty interesting.
It's the same progression that the establishment greets many social movements. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you.
All right, I've got to connect these dots. I'm sure you're doing it yourself, but just in case you're not, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you. I mean, that's exactly what they did to Trump. And again, this is not intended to be a anything in regards to Trump. It's really not. It's just intended to open your eyes to the power of the mainstream media. And when they choose to go in a certain direction, they will take you into that direction. Seriously, that's all. That's what actually the only reason I wanted to do this was to kind of open you up to that.
Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl.
He wants free tuition for colleges. A great idea if you think money grows on bongs.
Senator Sanders is not electable.
The media has a laundry list of reasons why Bernie cannot be president. Mainstream media has constantly shifted its reasons. Electability.
There's this narrative that Bernie Sanders is not electable against Donald Trump, which is amazing. And it's amazing how strong that is, how much it's stuck, given that the data just doesn't prove that.
It's not just that Bernie is asking a lot of voters to buy into what I consider radical ideas like free public college, the Green New Deal, Medicare for all.
The media spins health care as Bernie Sanders has an utterly infeasible, pie-in-the-sky plan.
Some might say you were way too far left.
All right, so I really feel like this was the beginning of the birth of what is known as the progressive left. I mean, maybe it wasn't the beginning, but it was really when it started to kind of take on a persona. And that included Bernie, and primarily AOC was probably the second biggest name, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when it comes to the progressive left. And then this is how they would describe them.
Bernie is a socialist. Bernie is a communist.
This dope once adored the Sandinistas, a toxic bunch of commies. Sanders is so nutty, most kids should be allergic to him.
How can any kind of socialist win a general election in the United States?
Then you have the idea that Bernie can't win because he's a socialist. I mean, the truth is, yes, he's a democratic socialist. He has such a consistency and honesty. And even people who don't even like the idea of socialism, they find him trustworthy and compelling.
Even as Sanders did better and better in the polls, even as he was drawing crowds like a rock star at different rallies, there's always sort of a new counter narrative that was meant to sort of take him down a notch.
Again, I mean, the parallels with Trump are there. Even as Sanders did better and better in the polls, even though he took on this rock star persona, he had huge crowds. they would create a different narrative to take him down a notch. Man, that's pretty interesting. It really is.
The contempt is so strong and so open and so unchecked and so rampant, and there's no accountability.
I think you're disheveled, you're unlikable, and you're pushy.
Any possible narrative that they can create in order to discredit him, they will push, and it works.
The media's specific kind of coverage when they covered Bernie Sanders was, in many cases, coverage that didn't take him seriously and was always kind of sneering and scoffing at him.
So again, here's another case of what's being covered doesn't necessarily match what's taking place at these rallies. I mean, again, I think that's the case for Trump, and then definitely was the case for Bernie Sanders.
It just is so clear that the people of the United States want this progressive agenda. The media would do anything to put a halt to that agenda, which really, to me, lifts the veil of like how much corporate sponsorship there is and corporate incentivization in terms of how the media portrays information.
So one thing I did want to kind of bring into the mix is, it's also a case of whether the powers that be or whomever was against Bernie Sanders really wanted this progressive agenda. I think the progressive agenda and, what is kind of known as, I guess, maybe a little bit, I don't know if it's the far left or if it's centrist left. I don't know which one they're calling that. But, that definitely goes against this uniparty model. And it goes against what the quote unquote establishment wants. So in addition to maybe, I think they thought he couldn't beat Trump, but part of it also now is becoming clear that, maybe they just didn't want this kind of progressive Democrat in the mix winning.
We would expect results faster than we did in Iowa, and God bless them, hundreds of people already here in line. They vote for sport here in New Hampshire.
Supporters watch the New Hampshire return slowly report. Most of the evening has Bernie Sanders and Mayor Pete within a couple points of each other. Too close for the networks to call until late into the night.
All right, CNN has a major projection right now. CNN projects that Bernie Sanders will win the New Hampshire Democratic presidential primary.
All right, so this is February 11th, 2020, and Bernie Sanders ended up winning the New Hampshire primary. February 11th, 2020. This is what I feel like is the beginning of the end for Bernie Sanders, and then the beginning of the beginning. You'll understand what I mean. The beginning of the beginning. So remember, at this point, Bernie Sanders won the popular vote in Iowa. He won the entire delegate, electoral, and popular vote in New Hampshire. And number 2 so far right now is Pete Buttigieg.
Mainstream media seizes the opportunity to raise questions about Sanders' campaign.
So the story of the Sanders campaign so far this year is how much ground he's lost from 4 years ago.
Sanders won this state handily back in 2016 with 60%, and it is notable that he saw nowhere near that level of support this time around.
That's the lowest win that you've ever seen in New Hampshire.
Don't get your hopes up on Bernie yet.
So again, instead of applauding his victories in these two, they're creating the narrative that he didn't win by as big of a margin as he did in 2016.
All this, but no one will focus on the fact that Bernie Sanders just won the popular vote in the first 2 states. No candidate in nearly half a century has won the first 2 states by popular vote and not been the nominee. The media downplays the success by pointing out that Iowa and New Hampshire do not really represent America and its diversity. Bernie's supporters are not diverse enough. Viewers of mainstream media constantly hear about the Bernie bro and the idea that a significant portion of his supporters are angry white men.
Wow, that's an interesting statement. Where else have we heard that? The significant portion of his supporters are angry white men.
Around January, February of 2016, we saw kind of a flurry of Bernie bro articles. It's anecdotal evidence presented as statistical proof.
The Bernie bro, an insufferable, aggressive, self-righteous left-wing activist who refers to everyone who doesn't share his narrow political views as a corporate puppet media whore.
You may have heard the term Bernie bro this election season, typically young, white, and male.
The Bernie bro, right? Somebody who's a bit younger, whiter.
It is so insulting for the media to consistently, put out this narrative that all Bernie supporters are these white, racist, sexist men who are saying horrible things to people.
And the Bernie bros, again, they're pretty obnoxious and they're very sexist.
The most violent, the most misogynistic, the most sexist, the most harmful.
People are mean on Twitter sometimes. This is not an exclusive phenomenon to Bernie Sanders, nor is it a particularly important topic of debate.
If you go online, most likely you're not going to get into squabbles with people on your side.
If you are still supporting Sanders as opposed to Warren, it's kind of showing your sexism.
That is crazy. That was on MSNBC. She said, if you're voting for Bernie Sanders instead of Elizabeth Warren, you're showing your sexism.
I can't vote for him because some of his supporters are rude to me online. like just hearing that, just hearing that, it's ridiculous.
This whole notion of a Bernie bro is the most blatant, pathetic attempt to try to turn possibly undecided voters off from actually looking into Bernie as their candidate.
Part of the Bernie bro narrative that's so frustrating is that Sanders is responsible for any and all and every person online. They are somehow extensions of Sanders.
If you say somebody is allowing something, by default, you are saying that they can do something about it.
And he can't.
And he can't.
Not too long ago, I came out as a Bernie bro, just as my attempt to kind of dispel the notion that all of Bernie's supporters look a certain way and that it's a very weird, cultish following.
We've seen that Bernie actually has had the most diverse coalition.
There is no hard data to support the Bernie bro myth, so I decided to look for the data and examine it myself. There are as many Bernie supporters online as there are all other candidates combined. I downloaded over 100 million tweets from all the followers of major candidates and analyzed them for their negativity. The data did show that 2% of Bernie supporters' tweets were quite negative. But the thing is that same percentage was true for all the candidates' supporters. There's a phenomenon called frequency illusion. If someone points something out to you, you're going to notice it more. And so because the media points out the nasty 2% of Bernie's supporters, people notice that.
Wow, that's interesting. Frequency illusion. So if somebody points out something, you're going to notice it more. I mean, that makes sense. So when the media is pointing out the 2% nasty Bernie bros, that's what people maybe get that perception. I just realized something. I realized that Bernie's bros was kind of a negative term. I thought that I didn't really realize that until now. I guess it's like when they call people tech bros or finance bros or whatever. But I guess that's kind of the negative version. Maybe the burners was the one I was thinking of, because I had a bunch of girls that I was friends with that were, they'd call themselves burners and they were Bernie Sanders fans. Yeah, I guess they would refer to themselves more as burners versus Bernie bros. Okay, man, I just learned something in the middle of this episode. Bernie bros is kind of a slam.
Rather than dealing with the substance, you can cherry pick some nasty comment on Twitter and use that as a way to dismiss everything that goes along with Bernie Sanders and his movement.
The Republican strategist Karl Rove used to say that you shouldn't hit your opponent where your opponent is weakest. You should actually hit them where they're strongest. I think it's inarguable that Bernie's greatest strength is actually his supporters. Dedication becomes fanaticism, passion becomes anger, and that's where you started to get all of these stories about how Bernie Sanders supporters were uniquely toxic, uniquely terrible, that they were responsible for behavior that was tantamount to abuse.
Oh my God, seriously, the parallels are just uncanny. Bernie Sanders supporters are uniquely toxic, uniquely terrible.
And that Bernie Sanders needed to disavow them. Over and over again, this line of attack was used. And I think it's very clear that, in fact, this was the Karl Rove strategy in action. Transform somebody's greatest strength into their biggest weakness.
All right, tell me if this sounds like something some other group might say or might be saying.
He's for us. He's going to help us make a difference, in this crooked world.
All right, so now we are in Nevada. And Bernie Sanders had just come from Bakersfield, California, where he talked to like a gigantic Latino Mexican crowd.
With Nevada and its large Latino population up next, coverage of the Bakersfield event is an interesting omission from the national conversation. And then, a new problem for the campaign. Just days before the Nevada caucus, culinary union leaders circulate a healthcare scorecard to their members, stating that Bernie's platform would end union healthcare. The message fails to mention that under Sanders' universal healthcare plan, they would have the same or better coverage.
The state's most influential union says a vote for Sanders is a vote to end health care as they know it.
How would you answer that union member who says, we fought for 5 years to get this health plan. It's a great gold-plated health plan. Why should we give it up for nationalized health care?
You're the one who is at war with the culinary union right here in Las Vegas. We got more union support than you have ever dreamed of.
All right, so that's interesting. They talked about unions. Obviously, the union stuff has been in play this election with Trump and Kamala and the Teamsters, not supporting the Democrats for the first time in a long time. And actually, what's more interesting is the Teamsters came out 60% in support of Trump, 34% in support of Kamala. So instead of outwardly supporting Trump, they just decided to abstain.
It's the Nevada caucus, another crucial early state. With Nevada's large Latino population, this is Bernie's first chance to prove that he's capable of drawing a diverse coalition.
One of the big narratives in the race was Bernie's campaign and his supporters are just too mean.
And the vicious attacks that the union said it received.
Are they going to go after him about the bad behavior of Bernie's supporters or not? Is this how they do things in Denmark?
And I think Bernie has a lot of questions to answer here.
If you looked at much of the news coverage was telling you that the real thing people should be worried about is the appropriateness of the tone of some Bernie Sanders supporters. It's an example of a completely manufactured narrative. It's not to excuse, this or that terrible tweet or this or that, terrible social media posting. It's only to say that it's the rough and tumble of a campaign, and when you are exclusively trying to scandalize one campaign's situation, and you're illustrating an actual attitude and bias that is not fair and is not objective.
The Bernie Bro narrative dominates coverage. Can Sanders' campaign overcome this latest attempt to derail his momentum? With voting underway in Nevada, Bernie heads to Texas, a state which months ago had him polling in single digits. Bernie decides to rally and watch the Nevada results in a heavily Latino-populated San Antonio.
All right, so just a quick recap. So he's won Iowa, he won New Hampshire, he looks like he's winning Las Vegas, and now, again, he's in Texas.
There's one thing that makes the establishment media, establishment Democrats and Republicans really nervous, and that's every time Bernie Sanders starts doing really well. Because the more better he does, the more everybody worries about them not being relevant because they're falling in line with everybody else, whether it's the corporate media or whether it's the establishment.
There is real concern right now that Bernie Sanders is so far ahead in the lead here in Nevada and then might go to South Carolina, further fracture that Joe Biden support among African Americans, sweep up a ton of delegates in California, currently where he's leading by a large margin in the polls, and then become essentially unstoppable.
All right, so that's the first time you heard Biden's name. But again, remember, listen to what she's saying. She's basically saying he's so far in the lead. He's got all the momentum in California. He wins Nevada, and then he's going to head to South Carolina. Maybe he was in Texas just, I don't know, for a viewing party or something.
I think the way that the mainstream media has portrayed Bernie and his supporters is extremely unfair. There's that Bernie bro stereotype where clearly I am a Hispanic female, I am not a white male, and really Bernie has proven to have a very, very diverse supporter base.
Election returns from Nevada come in swiftly. A reporter is heard gasping as she reports that Bernie is winning in a landslide.
These, again, are people who work on the Strip. The majority are Latino, and they are clearly, at least from eyeballing it, strongly in favor of Bernie Sanders, with Joe Biden coming in second.
All right, so that's interesting. So this is I think the third state. Remember, Bernie's won Iowa, the popular vote. He won the entire thing in New Hampshire, and it looks like now he's going to win Nevada. But again, now Biden all of a sudden is in second.
And now I'm delighted to bring you some pretty good news. I think all of you know we won the popular vote in Iowa. We won the New Hampshire primary. And according to 3 networks in the AP, we have now won the Nevada caucus.
NBC News projects Bernie Sanders, the winner in Nevada. Brand new breaking news numbers coming right out of Nevada.
Don't tell anybody. I don't want to get them nervous. We're going to win the Democratic primary.
All right, maybe now is kind of the beginning of the end. I thought it was after New Hampshire, but maybe now after what feels like a pretty landslide victory in Nevada, this is where they start to really, I guess, get worried.
The happiest person right now, it's about 1:15 Moscow time. This thing is going very well for Vladimir Putin. I promise you. He's probably staying up watching us right now. How you doing, Vlad?
That's that James Carville guy. That guy's a clown, bringing up Putin. That's funny.
If another candidate had won Nevada, it would have been a celebration on cable TV news. Instead, it was like a funeral.
The cable news coverage is not dominated by how Sanders had built a diverse winning coalition in Nevada, but rather, can anyone stop Sanders?
That, again, illustrated what was really at work on a day-to-day basis on cable TV news.
No one else is as hungry, angry, enraged, and determined as Sanders voters. Democrats need to sober up and figure out what the hell they're going to do about that.
You have to remember, it wasn't just at that moment in Nevada. It was like, oh, this is what you guys have been talking about for much of the campaign. Now it's on full display for everybody to see.
The frustration from mainstream media news is as clear as Bernie's Nevada win. On primetime air, Chris Matthews lets his disgust overwhelm his judgment.
I'm reading last night about the fall of France in the summer of 1940, and the General Renault calls up Churchill and says, "It's over."
Chris Matthews compares Bernie's win to World War II and the rise of Nazism.
And Churchill said, "How can it be? You got the greatest army in Europe. How can it be over?" He said, "It's over."
All right, so remember, at this point, Bernie's winning. He's kicking ass. He's won the first 3.
With winning the popular vote in the first 3 states, Bernie is surging. But mainstream media tries to suppress this narrative in a pattern that's been going on for years.
This power apparatus that we're living in, I mean, it is well built. It is a well-functioning machine.
We're always told that CNN and MSNBC are the anti-Trump channels. They're also the anti-Bernie channels.
That was pretty interesting. So again, just I hope you're seeing the correlations, and even more importantly than the correlations, I hope you're seeing the power that the mainstream media has, what they have the ability to do.
Ed Schultz was told not to cover Bernie Sanders, not to cover him during the primary in 2015-16. He covered him anyway. He was fired for that.
When Bernie Sanders was announcing that he was going to be a candidate for the nomination of the Democratic Party in Burlington, Vermont, I was the only cable host between Fox, MSNBC, and CNN that was there live to cover it. I'd go to Bernie Sanders' house that afternoon, an interview in the backyard, about a 15-minute interview. The grandkids are running around. It's a big day for the Sanders family. He's going to announce that he's running for president. We're going to carry it live later on in the day, and we're going to run this one-on-one tape with Bernie. 3,000 people are there on Lake Champlain. It's 5 minutes to air, and I get a phone call from Phil Griffin. "You're not covering this." I said, "Phil, Bernie Sanders is announcing he's running for president. He's going to be a president." "I don't care. You're not covering this." We were told that we had to cover something down in Texas that was totally meaningless.
That's the history of MSNBC and their journalism. If you tell the truth about progressives or if you tell the truth about a war, you're going to get fired.
The fix was in with the mainstream media. The fix was in with managing the news and shutting down Bernie Sanders. And it wasn't until he started matching the Clintons and raising money that he became, well, we got to cover this guy.
That's pretty funny. That's pretty funny. So then he started raising money, and then with that money, he's buying ads. You know, he's putting that money, giving that money to MSNBC, CNN, and then that's when they're like, oh, okay, we'll take that money.
The media wants to generate clicks, it wants sensational stories, but it also wants, for example, to maintain friends in high places.
Yeah, I was going to say, even though I'm sure they wanted to take his money, I think the friends in high places trumps, no pun intended. Well, maybe kind of pun intended. No, actually, no pun intended. I think it trumps Bernie's money in that case.
I worked on the Phil Donahue show at MSNBC in 2002 and 2003. We were canceled for political reasons 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, saying, oh, we wasn't getting the ratings we had hoped for. And God bless whistleblowers, someone inside NBC News leaked documents. NBC did not want an anti-war voice on the air.
So that was pretty interesting, talking about Phil Donahue and them not wanting an anti-war voice on the air. And this is why.
They were also owned by General Electric at the time, which was a defense contractor, and they stood to make billions, if not, more off the war.
Let me tell you something. You say the wrong thing, you don't get advertisers. You don't get advertisers, you're not on the air very long. The mainstream media in this country is about one thing. That's making money.
With a convincing win in Nevada, Bernie heads to Austin. A rally of over 12,000 faithful supporters convene to celebrate Bernie Sanders and prepare for Super Tuesday, where Texas, among 13 other states, will vote. After years of being insulted and dismissed, Bernie Sanders' movement has won the popular vote in the first 3 states.
So again, at this point, we're probably in mid to late March, February. So this is probably like February 20th, 21st, something along those lines. And again, Bernie's winning, and he's winning the popular vote. But again, I mean, it's hard to remember back then, but I don't know if everybody really knew that or everybody was fully aware.
Every time Bernie takes a win in any of these states, they're completely not even trying to hide the fact that they're undermining his wins.
There's not a lot of attention that's being paid to his victories. That's kind of impacting his momentum.
While thousands of Sanders supporters packed the Austin rally, mainstream media reaches millions of viewers, raising the concerns that if Sanders comes out of Super Tuesday with the most delegates, he would be unstoppable.
Okay, so real quick, Super Tuesday is like the Tuesday where a ton of states have their primaries or their caucuses or whatever. I forget the difference between those two. But anyway, the point is Super Tuesday is like the big day where a lot of states will give their delegates, and basically whoever wins that pretty much will get the nomination.
I cannot believe how many people are here. It's amazing. Now, I've been hearing, the establishment is getting a little bit nervous about our campaign. Their nightmare is when they see, not only in Austin, but all over this country, millions of people standing up for justice. That is what this campaign is about. Yes, Wall Street is powerful. The drug companies are powerful. The insurance companies are powerful. The military-industrial complex is powerful.
I will say there are a lot of good things about Bernie Sanders. Like, basically what he just said. I mean, that is definitely all true and impressive for him to say it. The problem is he just doesn't have the power, man. He's never had the power.
While the Austin rally is in full swing, cable news pays little attention. Instead, they circle their talking points around a 60 minutes promo clip of an interview with Senator Sanders that will air later that night. The clip features Bernie Sanders expressing that not everything Fidel Castro did was bad. In an interview from 1985, he cites Castro's literacy program.
He educated the kids, gave them health care, totally transformed the society.
News outlets shift to a different narrative. Sanders is not electable because of his complimentary views of Castro's literacy program.
There was a couple dynamics at play. I mean, there was an effort to blow up anything Bernie said that was controversial into an enormous controversy. I mean, Bernie got asked one question about Fidel Castro. It became a 4-day news story.
Shouldn't we judge dictators by the violation of human rights and not by any of their alleged achievements?
If you only tune into the news, you might think that Bernie Sanders was campaigning for Fidel Castro. I mean, he was literally on 60 Minutes and he was asked a question about it, answered a question in a very similar way, by the way, that Barack Obama answered the question, and it was like some huge controversy.
There's a saying here in South Florida by many Cubans that they say, you know, Castro may have given us health care and education, but he didn't give us breakfast, lunch, or dinner.
They're attacking your comment as absolutely unacceptable, singing the praises of a murderous tyrant.
All right. So again, I mean, there you see another shift in narrative. You know, they basically, I don't know if they're going to play the what he said about Castro, but you know, it's like association, word association, human edition. So instead of really talking about Bernie's, I guess, lead, you know, they're going after something totally different to try and derail the conversation and derail him.
It's the 10th Democratic debate, 4 days before the South Carolina primary. The latest narrative frames Sanders as a radical communist sympathizer, someone far from the party's current core message and comfort zone. Bernie's contentious relationship with the DNC is not new.
There's been a war in the Democratic Party, and the donor class are on one side, and the progressives and the base are on the other side.
In 2016, the moderate side was heavily favored when Hillary Clinton received nearly all the superdelegate support before primary voting had even begun.
Unpledged delegates exist really to make sure that party leaders and elected officials don't have to be in a position where they are running against grassroots activists. And so we separate out those unpledged delegates to make sure that there isn't competition between.
I'll really try to delve into this delegates and super delegates, and then what she's talking about, unpledged delegates. I mean, honestly, what that lady just said kind of made no sense to me.
I'm not sure that answer would satisfy an anxious young voter.
Okay, and I guess I was not the only one.
CNN hosted a town hall featuring Hillary Clinton, and then CNN contributor, now DNC interim chair Donna Brazile, actually gave the Clinton campaign an advance notice of a question that they were going to ask.
And that is obviously biasing the debate because Bernie Sanders didn't have any questions in advance.
All right, so this next thing is interesting. I don't know if I agree with it, but, you know, it's definitely an interesting point. I think I touched on it potentially a little bit earlier.
What many in the Democratic Party establishment fear is not that Bernie couldn't beat Trump. It's that Bernie would beat Trump, transform the Democratic Party, and transform the country.
I mean, it's plausible, I guess, but I think more they didn't think he could beat Trump. I don't think they were concerned about him beating Trump and then transforming the Democratic Party because, you know, you've got Congress. I think you could put enough pressure on him or roadblocks in front of him, similar to what they did with Trump in his first 2 years for sure, that, you know, you could definitely manage that versus thinking he could beat Trump.
With Bernie leading in the polls, Chris Matthews encourages the other candidates to attack the frontrunner. The Stop Sanders movement is on full display.
All right, maybe this is where they really turn up the heat. So give a listen to Chris Matthews, sorry.
This one feels, because of the Bloomberg factor, feels like a big moment that we can predict it's going to be a big moment. Good or bad, which way it'll go, we don't know. Does it feel like that to you?
Yeah, and I hope that the candidates who have been telegraphing their punches against Sanders, Senator Sanders, are actually going to deliver them.
Can Americans trust that a democratic socialist president will not give authoritarians a free pass?
And that's why Russia is helping you get elected, so you'll lose to him.
Imagine spending the better part of 2020 with Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump.
Pete Buttigieg is another guy that kind of gets under my skin. I think he's such a putz.
Think about what that will be like for this country.
What began as a blackout, and then, first they ignored him, then they laughed at him, then they attacked him. And the attacks really accelerated when it became clear Bernie could be the nominee.
You can't do it. You cannot talk about Fidel Castro's literacy programs. You just can't. Not in American politics, and you shouldn't be able to. That ain't cool, not just with former Republicans. That ain't cool with South Carolina voters. That ain't cool with Democrats.
The race turns to South Carolina. Mainstream media argues that the candidate who takes South Carolina will be in the driver's seat to win the nomination. A new state and a new media narrative.
These southern states that are considered locked up for Biden in terms of the black vote.
All right, so I think I remember at this point, Biden was sort of in the mix now. So it's almost down to like Bernie versus Biden, or yeah, for the most part.
Nobody was questioning the fact that Joe Biden had lied on numerous occasions about being involved in the civil rights movement as a frontline organizer, which he was not, and also about engaging in civil disobedience against Nelson Mandela's imprisonment in apartheid South Africa. Those were two blatant lies that Joe Biden perpetrated, and yet he was never asked, not in the debates or any interviews by pundits, about these lies.
If he can lie to black people about getting arrested, going to see trying to see Nelson Mandela, if he can lie time and time again over the years, and people not completely oust this guy and disqualify him, and they instead say, yeah, he's our candidate, he's our guy, Uncle Joe, we believe in him. If that happens, then right now we're living in a reality where the facts are not the priority.
That seriously is pretty wild. All the tall tales Biden's told over the years. There's video of him saying he was like first in his class in law school, and that got debunked. There's this stuff about him going to see Nelson Mandela. That never happened. That's wild.
NBC News is now projecting that former Vice President Joe Biden has won a decisive victory in the South Carolina Democratic primary.
Heading into a state like South Carolina, the odds were stacked against us. Biden basically, in many ways, got a pass on his record. Bernie would periodically bring up past votes that Biden had taken. He said he didn't write the bankruptcy bill that was literally his bankruptcy bill. At one point, he sort of said that he had always been against the Iraq War. At another point, he just denied that he ever pushed to cut Social Security. I mean, these are just blatant lies. I mean, they're just verifiable, demonstrable lies that really were not fact-checked at all. You could criticize our campaign for not more intensely and repeatedly pushing that message, but there's also a media culpability here, which part of the job of the media is to actually legitimately fact-check these things. There are objective facts and truth, and in a lot of ways, the media did not do its job to actually make sure that the conversation that was happening on the campaign trail was rooted in fact. I mean, there is a referee role that the media just refused to play. The media couldn't bring itself to simply state a fact.
I mean, again, this just shows how powerful the media is and what a big stick they wield.
South Carolina is when we saw the big shift in the media narrative. We saw it shift from a very likely Sanders presidency to it's all over. Biden has captured the popular imagination and spirit of the American voter. He has crushed it.
All right, again, the important part of that is, all of a sudden, I mean, yes, Biden won South Carolina, but that was one state, whereas Bernie had won 4 by now, but they started to just shape the narrative and shape it toward Biden.
Within 48 to 72 hours of Super Tuesday, the media began bringing on trusted party folks and started really ringing the alarm bell about Sanders' candidacy.
Sanders is just may well have this thing locked down.
Well, unless something fundamentally changes, and that would mean Bernie Sanders' vote share would have to drop precipitously, and I don't think we see any evidence of that. Or somebody, and I think at this point it's more likely to have to be one person than two, emerges. He's going to exit Super Tuesday with, if not an insurmountable pledged delegate lead, a significant one.
We are a multi-generational, multiracial, grassroots movement.
All right. So again, maybe I spoke a little too early on that, but he's still in the lead. I mean, listen to what those guys said. Bernie is still kind of the dominant player going into Super Tuesday.
It's 24 hours before Super Tuesday. The question remains, is there an anti-Bernie bias in the media and the Democratic Party?
It's just been sort of a whiplash period for all of us following the Biden campaign. There were a lot of folks on the Biden campaign who didn't think they'd even be around for Super Tuesday.
All right, so this is where it gets really interesting. And again, you heard what that person said. A lot of people in the Biden campaign didn't even think they'd be around for Super Tuesday, but obviously they are. But this is where it gets really interesting. And this is where I feel like, the dominoes start to fall.
Out of the public eye, Pete and Amy fly to Dallas, Texas to meet up with Joe Biden for a scheduled rally just 24 hours before Super Tuesday. Beto joins Amy and Pete for a Biden rally where they shock the world with their abrupt departure from the race to endorse.
So again, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Booty Juice, as Biden called him that one time, Mr. Booty Juice. And then Beto O'Rourke, man, that guy's a tool as well, holy mackerel. So those guys fly to Texas to basically all three of them drop out of the race to support
Joe Biden.
Ladies and gentlemen, el próximo presidente de los Estados Unidos, Joe Biden. Let's do it for Joe.
I'm delighted to endorse and support Joe Biden for president.
Today, I am ending my campaign and endorsing Joe Biden for president.
All right, so those three dropped out. By the way, I just realized, literally, there's no mention of Kamala Harris in this entire documentary. And again, remember, she ran for president in 2020 as well. And that's because she was the first one to drop out, because she literally got no delegate votes at all. Isn't that funny?
Bernie is blindsided. The photo op is national news for the next 24 hours leading up to the Super Tuesday vote.
Establishment candidates all suddenly got in line behind Joe Biden. That's a huge amount of power marshaled for him. Between South Carolina and Super Tuesday, there was also an enormous amount, tens of millions of dollars of free media coverage for Biden that was almost entirely positive. That played a huge role. And I think that was the wave that much of the establishment media, the corporate media, the billionaire-owned media was waiting for.
In just a matter of hours, voters in 14 states begin the process of heading to the polls for Super Tuesday.
Super Tuesday is the most crucial day so far in the Democratic race for the White House. 14 states vote and American Samoa vote, a third of the delegates up for grabs.
What happened recently with the endorsements of Klobuchar and Buttigieg and O'Rourke, they all support Biden now. It's like they're trying to tell us, hey, everybody, Biden's the one. Forget about kooky Sanders. What he says is crazy. Don't vote for him.
All right, so now I believe we are in the midst of Super Tuesday.
The Fox News Decision Desk can now project that former Vice President Joe Biden will win the state of Alabama, racking up his third victory of the night.
I think we have a new call. We do from the state of Arkansas. Minnesota, Joe Biden, the projected winner.
Joe Biden will come out with a vote victory in Texas.
Joe Biden has bounced back, and the path doesn't look any easier for his top competitor, Senator Bernie Sanders.
It's been pretty disgusting how the entire establishment has banded together to kind of drown out his message.
I think it's not okay. It's insulting. It's demeaning. It's degrading.
Joe Biden's already had the night he needs. If Joe Biden leaves Super Tuesday with more delegates than anybody else, it will be nearly impossible for Sanders to stop him.
You know, we faced a uniquely uphill climb. We're going up against a vice president in a political system in which vice presidents essentially never lose the nomination of their party when they see.
I will say that's a good point. I mean, as a vice president, especially coming off of 8 years with being with Obama, you shouldn't lose your party's nomination.
Look, I think we could have done a better job of consistently contrasting with Joe Biden to make clear what the primary election choice was really all about in very explicit terms. There were strategic considerations. There was a media environment that said anytime you bring up anything even mildly contrastive, you're a horrible human being and you're hurting the party's unity.
CNN analyst Gloria Borger put it in a way that I thought was kind of perfect. She said the waters parted for Joe Biden.
That's a pretty interesting statement from the CNN reporter lady. The waters parted for Joe Biden.
She said he didn't even do anything to part those waters, which gets at the passive nature of the way that the kind of establishment kind of walked him to the nomination.
The history of the Democratic Party and its primaries is a history of candidates really, really contrasting with each other. I mean, I know there are people out there, oh my God, it was the most negative primary I've ever seen in my life. It's like, you must have been asleep for the last 50 years. That is not the way politics works. That is not the history of America.
The reason Bernie Sanders doesn't identify as a Democrat is because he believes that the capitalist class essentially has two parties at its disposal. It's working people ought to have at least one. Younger millennials and Zoomers have come of age at a time where our politics is deeply cynical. They see more critically the flaws of the Republican establishment, but also the Democratic establishment. And so even though they are progressive by and large in their values, that doesn't mean that they're going to be Democratic Party loyalists.
For the past 25 years, about 35% of Americans identify as independent. Despite such a large independent voting bloc, there's great pressure on voters to only support the bigger parties.
So there's the Democrats and the Republicans, and it's one major force against another major force. It's not very complicated.
A vote for a third party is typically considered throwing away a vote. More than half of American independents end up voting for one of the two big parties.
That's a whole nother issue, but that's definitely the crux of what a lot of people want to try and change is, this two-party system that we're kind of stuck with.
The vote blue no matter who, it's so perfect. They're so out of touch and ineffective that they don't even understand that that's the most alienating name. Like, if they actually wanted people to vote blue no matter who, they wouldn't use that PR name. You're wearing this, tribalism and lack of any moral or political imagination on your sleeve. Like, we know that's what you think, but you really should have a different mantra.
I'm opposed to the hashtag blue no matter who because it brings us back into these lesser of two evil arguments, and we end up supporting corporate Democrats who, except in the areas of identity politics, vote no differently from their Republican counterparts.
Having two parties who are in contention with each other at all times makes for really good television.
Ha, that is very well said. Two parties that are in contrast with each other at all times absolutely makes for good television. It makes for good ratings, and it makes for money. It makes for money, especially for the mainstream media companies, which are now controlled by 4 big corporations.
A week and a half ago, Bernie's march to the nomination was strong.
You cannot beat Trump with the same old kind of politics. What we need is a new politics that brings working class people into our political movement.
All right, so as we progress through this thing, who knows? Maybe it was twofold. Maybe they didn't think Bernie could beat Trump, coupled with if Bernie did beat Trump, that's not who they wanted to be in charge.
It's also pretty enlightening to see just how the great lengths that people would go to sort of make sure that things don't change, that the status quo remains the same.
All right, that definitely gets back to the argument that I've talked about a lot of times in terms of, the uniparty concept, two heads of the same snake, batting it back and forth, 4 years Republican, 8 years Democrat, 8 years Republican, 4 years Democrat, all that. And I definitely think, Biden fell under that for sure. But maybe they were worried that Bernie Sanders would not play along those lines.
A shell-shocked Sanders campaign goes into overdrive in an attempt to win the coveted swing state of Michigan.
What a difference a week makes!
The polls have flipped since Super Tuesday, and Sanders' campaign is desperately looking for a lifeline of encouraging results. The March 10th primary, 6 states vote. Michigan is the largest prize.
All right. Now, to be fair, who knows? I guess maybe anything can happen, but it is interesting that in a week, the momentum and everything just completely flip-flopped. All right. So now it is March 10th. I think things are going to get really interesting now. And we're headed into the swing state of Michigan, among a few others.
The campaign arrives in Cleveland, where it's scheduled to have an election night party to receive the results. But something even more disruptive is on the horizon.
We got here early so we can stand in line, and as we were walking through the parking garage, someone said, "Hey, it's canceled."
It was a Sanders rally canceled due to concerns over the coronavirus outbreak. There were a couple reported cases here in Ohio.
We're super sad. We were really stoked about this. I'm kind of an introvert, so to come out here with so many people was a big deal for me. I was excited to be a part of this movement and, show my kids how to be an active citizen.
All right, get ready to relive some painful memories. So again, it's March 10th. Biden definitely is in control now. I think he's won, a bunch of the previous states from Super Tuesday, but it's still a race. It's definitely still a race in terms of him against Bernie.
Tonight, for the first time, the coronavirus is forcing candidates to call off rallies. 6 states are holding primaries and caucuses today. Joe Biden has won 11 of the past 16 contests and now leads Bernie Sanders by almost 100 delegates.
Joe Biden is on a roll.
You see the Biden blue on the map, 10 wins for the former vice president.
I think tonight's definitely a should-win night for Bernie. I don't want to say that it's an all-or-nothing thing, but I think that the media is trying to make it seem like it's a bigger deal.
If Bernie can't pull off a win there in Michigan, and the path forward is very, very hard, what happens to that campaign? At some point, does someone talk to him and say, listen, we have to rally around the nominee?
And take a look at this. CNN now projects Joe Biden is the winner in Michigan. 125 delegates are at stake. Joe Biden is the Democratic presidential primary winner in Michigan. So far tonight, he has won Michigan, Mississippi, and Missouri. 3 important states, very significant wins for the former vice president. Jake and Dana, this is what Biden was really hoping for.
Even though it's difficult and exhausting and saddening, I know that we just have to keep moving forward and that there's always more to do.
All right. So at this point, the rallies are done. There's no one really out and about. And it definitely feels like Biden's in charge.
I think Bernie Sanders is done.
Yeah.
If I was him, I'd probably go ahead and drop out tomorrow and let's.
You think tomorrow?
Joe Biden will be the nominee, the presumptive nominee now after tonight, clearly.
Yeah.
I think Bernie's gone. I think it's done. Let's go.
Coronavirus has affected the election primarily by shutting it down. There are no more rallies. There's no more canvassing.
Democrats now have a reason to put all of democracy on hold and basically say we've got our guy and the coronavirus crisis has shut everything down and it's selfish for Bernie to even stay in the race.
All right. So this next part shifts gears. Well, not really shifts gears, but it talks more kind of from a macro perspective about almost really what took place in reaction to the coronavirus. So give this a listen. I was going to cut this out, but I think it's interesting to hear this.
Coronavirus has brought an extreme urgency to the Sanders message.
Feeling is that you cannot simply give $50 billion to the airline industry. And if you're going to bail out tourism, if you're going to bail out hotels, etc., what you have to do is make sure that that money is going to protect working people.
And as you see right now during this crisis, that they have mechanisms in place to save the economy, to save the corporations, but there's no mechanisms in place to save people. Right now, immediately you need $1 trillion to Wall Street, boom, $2 trillion, $3 trillion, $1 trillion a day will give it to you.
That's Jimmy Dore again. And you know, he's so spot on. It's like when the bailout money for the industries are needed, it happens immediately. But then when money needs to go to the American people, similar to what's taking place right now in Asheville, North Carolina, and in Florida because of the hurricanes.
Hey, we need $2,000 for a taxpayer. We just can't seem to get that done.
While he assesses his campaign, Bernie turns his focus to the COVID stimulus package.
And now I find that some of my Republican colleagues are very distressed. They're very upset that somebody who's making $10, $12 an hour might end up with a paycheck for 4 months more than they received last week. Oh my God, the universe is collapsing.
The coronavirus crisis and the economic crisis that it has caused has led a lot of people to start demanding the emergency implementation of Bernie Sanders' platform.
Every inch of Brookdale Hospital Medical Center in Brooklyn now inundated with those suffering from COVID-19.
As the pandemic rages on, a news story, completely ignored by all major news outlets, is revealed by independent journalists.
All right, this part's pretty crazy because, I mean, I do remember it, but I don't even know if a lot of you will remember it. But basically, in the middle of all of that stuff and when Corona started, if you remember, this story broke and it was the end of the Me Too movement because nobody believed her. I'm sorry, correction. The mainstream media reported not to believe her.
So why don't you tell us what happened?
We were alone, and it was the strangest thing. There was no, exchange, really. His hands were on me and underneath my clothes.
Do you guys remember who that was and who she's talking about?
The coronavirus pandemic has all but shut the 2020 Democratic primaries down. With near constant media attention on the virus, there's one new election story the mainstream media refuses to tell. Independent journalist Katie Halper breaks the story on her weekly podcast. She interviews a former staffer for Biden in the early 90s. The victim alleges sexual assault.
And then he went down my skirt, but then up inside it.
I wanted someone who doesn't have such a record as a Sanders supporter to tell the story because I thought I wanted to make sure people didn't think I was politicizing it or, that this wasn't a totally honest story, which it is.
I don't know why they didn't mention her name, but this was that Tara Reid gal, Tara Reid. And literally, this is like the only woman who came forward and accused someone of sexual assault and whatever, and just was not believed. I feel like this literally, I'm not kidding, put an end to the Me Too movement. She's like, me too. And they're like, nah.
I looked up to him. He was like my father's age. He was this champion of women's rights. In my eyes, I have no platform. I am no one.
I believe her. I spoke to her brother and her friend, both of whom remember her telling about the incident at the time. But no one else will tell her story.
Tara Reid had a very hard time getting her story told, vetted, shared at all.
You see, there's a powerful club here in this town, and you're not in it, and neither is Tara. I thought Tara deserved a full vetting and a fair hearing from a mainstream outlet. But as I reached out to mainstream folks that I know to see if they were interested in breaking this bombshell story, I heard back crickets. Nothing. No one seemed to want to touch it.
And you can bet that if the shoe were on the other foot and you had a similarly credible accuser of Bernie Sanders, there's no doubt that she would have no trouble whatsoever getting tons of coverage. So it's an incredibly powerful example of the way that this ideological bias works to help the anointed candidate, Joe Biden, and you just see this glaring hypocrisy from people who would use the hashtag #BelieveWomen, who would use the hashtag #MeToo, and yet with Tara Reade, they find every excuse in the book to try to not take her allegations seriously.
All right, so I know those are serious allegations, and again, they all are serious allegations, but it is interesting that that one was the one at that timing that just went absolutely nowhere.
Instead of immediately reporting Tara Reade's story, pundits continued to turn out anti-Sanders reporting. Mainstream media outlets delayed covering Tara Reade's story until much later, causing the allegation to have no real impact on the primary race.
By the way, the other thing that COVID did was it shut down the debates. So I'll have to go back. I think there was only one debate that election cycle, and it was pretty brutal. I mean, I remember Biden and Kamala going at each other. So I'll have to try and download that.
On April 8th, Bernie Sanders suspends his presidential campaign.
Again, I'm not saying that we didn't make mistakes. I'm not saying that we ran a perfect campaign, but I am saying that anybody who pretends that this was a fair contest is just not being truthful. We were up against a media that felt existentially threatened by the agenda of Bernie Sanders, and all of that power was brought to bear against us. And that is a real dynamic, and that will be a real dynamic for any candidate who champions the same agenda moving forward.
All right, so now, I mean, that's kind of a wrap. That's kind of a wrap. So I think he's going to drop out soon, but let's hear what the rest of them had to say.
Because if there's one thing that we learned in this campaign, it is how powerful mainstream media still really is, how much sway their narrative setting has over the public discourse.
She's so right. They really do have so much sway over the public discourse. Okay, this is really interesting.
Jeff Winchell performed a final analysis of the amount of coverage MSNBC gave Bernie Sanders throughout the campaign. In the early portion where he was the frontrunner, the other candidates were mentioned distinctly more. There are only 2 moments when Bernie received more coverage than other candidates: after his Super Tuesday loss and the day after he suspended his campaign.
How crazy is that? The only times he got more coverage was after his Super Tuesday loss and then the day he suspended his campaign.
It's a glaring example of how the mainstream media chose to emphasize his campaign's problems and to undermine his successes. The campaign is over, but despite this loss, his entire grassroots movement makes it clear that a new generation is willing to stand up against traditional power structures in America.
I think there is an exciting trend of new alternative media.
All right, let me give Bernie the last word here.
The major challenge we face is not only a redistribution of wealth, which is important, but a redistribution of power, making the average American feel, this is my country, this is a democracy. I can shape the future. The people don't feel that now. They sit down, they watch the tube for 40 or 50 hours a week, they hold their nose, they vote for the lesser of 2 evils. Now that to me is the major problem. And once we can begin to deal with that problem, I think other things will follow.
All right, there you have it, folks. There is Bernie's Blackout, and I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope I feel like it was very interesting to listen to that entire process. Obviously, coming out of that, we went into the presidential election between Biden and Trump, and obviously tremendous controversy with that. But, in terms of the role of the media and really silencing Bernie Sanders, obviously the reach of that is significant. And you kind of saw that happen to where he started out incredibly strong. And then once that blackout really came into place, he pretty much lost all momentum. All right, there you have it. I cut 30 minutes out too, so we ended up at around an hour and a half. That's about it. Have a great weekend. Call a spade a spade. Talk to you soon.
That was a great way to end it.
This episode was brought to you by the new book, Deep Shallow Dive Into You, available now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble in hardcover and paperback. Don't forget to sign up for our new mailing list on our website at deepshallowdive.com.